Hello, I'm Emily Elias.
Are you going to keep that?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm Tom Wiggins, and this is Desert Island Dips, the podcast where we pit condiment against condiment and ask, if you were trapped on a desert island, which 5 dips would you take with you?
Ketchup, brown sauce, English mustard, ajika, and sriracha. They are all safe. They are the top 5 condiments that we have designated to be saved for the sake of humanity. But this week is an absolutely controversial episode for Mr. Wiggins.
I can't believe I'm even here, to be honest with you.
It's time to get politely patriotic for Canada.
I mean, you say that like I've got an issue. It makes it sound like I've got an issue with Canada.
Maple syrup, maple syrup.
Not a condiment, not a condiment.
Okay, why is maple syrup not a condiment to you?
Because you don't put it on your dinner.
But you put it on breakfast.
You put it on one very specific breakfast.
Pancakes, waffles, bacon.
Not having it. Not having it.
Well, get ready for an uphill battle, ladies and gents. I like maple syrup.
I didn't say I don't like it. I said it's not a condiment.
I think you're being too like Brexity about your condiment.
You mean I've just got standards and I stick to them?
Okay, well.
Convince me.
I'm going to convince you with one word, an Algonquin. Sinzibukwad.
No, it hasn't convinced me.
Okay, well, I'm going to get to the history. So it basically is a translation that says is drawn from wood. So that's where maple syrup comes from. Trees. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So according to researchers at Ohio State University, Algonquins kind of recognized that this magical sap coming from the tree was a great energy booster. And they started like collecting it in the spring when they would make use a stone to make a V sort of shaped injection into the tree trunk.
Right.
Put like a little bucket collecting filter
Is
underneath
it called tapping?
That is what it is called.
Yeah.
But this is kind of like in the early days. So they didn't really have like all the terminology for it.
Yeah.
And then because you would get this like syrup, it still needed to be processed somehow. So they would put stones in a fire to heat the stones up. And then they would put the stones into the bucket of sap. And it would dissolve out all of the water. And then you would be left with this delicious maple syrup.
Right.
So that's essentially how maple syrup is made. That was the
Whose
process.
idea was this?
The process from that has not changed like very much since then. And obviously like 16th century Europeans came over, saw what natives were doing to getting sugar, and they're like, hey, we like sugar too. Like, let's do that.
Share the wealth. Yeah.
Let's get some sugar in this joint because I can only imagine that like early life as a settler was mega depressing. Like, hey, I left my friends and family and everybody I knew behind because I was promised land. And guess what? Like, I have to build the house on it, and I have no discernible skills to do this.
And steal it from somebody that already lives there.
Definitely. Oh, yeah. That little detail. So I think, like, sugar probably was, like, a really big deal of, like, just getting that, like...
Just your one joy that you had was just sugar.
Maple sugar, maple
yeah.
syrup. So there are like tons of maple syrup councils.
Times have changed, by the way. I'm not having that as a reason to put it on the island.
Because it's not in 16th century Canada anymore?
We live in a different time. Yeah.
Okay, easy. So I looked at all these like various like maple syrup councils, and they all have really sort of like whitewashy kind of language about like where like how maple syrup grew and like the industry in itself. But on the Maple Syrup Council's websites, there are some legends that they propose for the discovery. And one of them I think is kind of interesting. And it relates to Mother Earth called Kokomis. And she was the first to sort of like make a hole in a tree and get the syrup out. And she had a grandson named Manabush. And he was worried that this gift of the maple tree would be too easily obtained and that humans might become shiftless and lazy. So he added water to the maple syrup. Therefore, they had to do the process of like extracting the water so that they would enjoy and they wouldn't just sit there.
I mean, he's kind of got a point though, isn't he?
Yeah.
It's like saying if people have too much maple syrup, they'll get fat and lazy.
You got to make them work for it.
And what happened to the entire world, pretty much? Everyone's got fat and lazy.
Nailed it.
And it's all because of maple syrup. A good reason not to put it on the island.
Hey, it is because of sugar and our addiction to sugar. Don't make me get one of those like YouTube documentaries about how our brains are completely wired and sugar is the same as like cocaine.
We haven't got time for that.
No, YouTube that later. So anyway, 17th century rolls around. Basically, European dairy farmers, they kind of were like, hey, we're making milk all the time. That's great. But we want to like supplement our income. So they started tapping trees and creating sort of their own little like maple syrup industry. And the farmers would call the maple trees sugar bushes. And they would like drill in holes, hang buckets, take it to a sugar shack. Have you heard of a sugar shack?
I believe it's the nightclub from The Only Way is Essex.
It is. And it is also and it is also a place where you make maple syrup.
Is that what they call it?
Well, and that's where you get into this process of like distilling it. And there's 3 different grades of maple syrup, grade A, B, and C. And those sort of like are classified by the clarity of...
So a bit like virgin and extra virgin and all that with olive oil.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like you can see like the variant color change as you look at the 3 different types of maple syrup. So, you know, they have these sugar shacks and they are making all sorts of maple syrup and everybody's loving it, having a wonderful time with their sugar. But like, how familiar are you with like Canadian history? I'm going to go with like none. Like it wasn't taught in school.
Of course it wasn't.
So,
hey everyone, what lessons have you got today? Oh, I've got Canadian history later on.
All right, Tom. So back then, Canada wasn't Canada yet, and it was called British North America.
Yeah.
And
good name.
Great name.
Yeah.
Hey, BNA. And they were constantly having like sort of fights and skirmishes with the French. Like
bloody French. Yeah.
What we know as Quebec today was called New France.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the main colony that France had set up in the New World.
Yeah.
I'm air quoting the New World, but you can't really see that.
Did you say what year we're talking here?
So we're talking, I'm going to take us to like 1600s, 1700s. Yeah. So there's kind of...
Moby Dick set? Later than that?
I have no clue.
I feel like there's like New France or something in that. It's probably not important. Should we carry on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about like, obviously like as we're looking at this sort of early stage of the maple syrup industry, there are all sorts of like stories that kind of crop up. But I want to talk about one woman, a French Canadian woman. I'll say Canadian, but Canada didn't exist yet. So a New France woman named Agatha de Saint-Pierre de Repigny.
Very good.
Thank you. She was born in 1657 in Montreal, back when it was New France. Her parents were actually French, and they were some of the first settlers that had arrived there. So she is like early in the 8 days of this colony. And fun fact, her grandfather is this guy named Nicolas Gaud, who is also an ancestor to Hillary Clinton.
Blimey.
So
what a family tree.
Yeah. So this woman, Agatha, she's like, when she's 5 years old, her dad, grandfather, and this big-time merchant named Lambert Closs, they get killed by some Iroquois warriors. And she grows up, her mom remarries in like this prominent military family. And she goes to school and she marries when she's 28, which at the time is
quite late.
Yeah. For a gal to be getting married, you know.
Yeah.
She ends up having 7 children with this guy named Pierre Le Gardier de Repigny. And he is like from one of the oldest military families. Like he is super, like he would be like a lord, you know, like he's like well connected with the aristocracy, like whatevs. Clearly there's all these fights going on. So half the time he's out on the front lines and she's just like at home minding all of the business matters and taking care of everything. And she is apparently described as outshining her husband frequently because she was really good at being a businesswoman. But like, which is not something we hear about a lot.
I don't think that was back then. It wouldn't have been sort of something to celebrate, would it? They would have been like, don't let people find out about this because we'll be a laughing stock.
Yeah, and she was like at parties, she was like doing all these sorts of contracts with fur traders and getting like everything sorted. And in 1702, France and England are fighting again, and a lot of the basics weren't available. So you couldn't get sugar. Like that was just like not there's, ships being disrupted all the time and shipments not coming through. And there are all sorts of rules about what you could and couldn't produce. Like in New France, you couldn't make fabric that had to come from France, like on edict of the king. So you couldn't make any form of textiles. And she was like, I want to get into this textile world because this is like a total racket of a market. So she's like, okay, well, I see that there's this sugar shortage. I know what I'm going to do. She goes over, hangs out with the First Nations that are near her. And she's like, teach me all your secrets about making maple syrup. And they do. She like nails it, figures it out. She's like bucketing it up, making maple candy. And she ends up sending her maple candy to Louis XIV, who's like, whoa, this is awesome. Yeah, you can make fabrics. I'm totally like jumping over history a lot here. But she was like, yeah, you can make fabrics. And then she was like, okay, I'm going to make fabrics. But she didn't have any weavers. So sorry, this is like...
I was just going to say it's not relevant experience, but yeah, carry on.
This is like, she like ransomed a bunch of British weavers. And she like, it's like, you guys can't go until you teach us how to weave. And she like kept them hostage until everybody... like all of her workers were able to weave, and then she made fabric. But without her maple syrup, she would not have become the successful businesswoman that she was.
The maple syrup was a vital stepping stone towards that happening.
And she received, until like every year, till like the day she died, 200 livres. I don't really know what that currency. She received money from Louis XIV every year until, she was a badass.
The way she goes. Well done to her.
So I would just like to point out that amazing story, maple syrup history. Yeah. Like it spawned a small revolution for a woman who is like, I like had never heard of her before until this research, but the government of Canada is pretty proud of her, and they've got like websites and pages dedicated to her awesomeness as a Montreal businesswoman in the early days of the country.
Well done to her. Well done to maple syrup. It's still not a condiment.
Okay, well, let's just do one of those like famous desert island dips time jumps.
Okay. Yeah.
Nowadays, there's no king of France.
No.
There is not a lot of buckets where you put like a faucet and get the maple syrup in a bucket.
No, I'm guessing the process has changed.
Slightly, but it's very similar. So they'll still like tap the trees, but they'll run like a plastic tubing that links them all together, kind of like the Matrix, and it looks like the trees are alive, and it's super creepy. And the like sap like in this spring like slowly kind of like as the trees melt, because it's a whole thing. The whole like process of getting the sap out of the trees has a lot to do with the weather. It has to be the right temperature, and like it has to be sort of like winter-ish spring thaw like to get this. I'm
sure there's a fail-safe to stop this from happening, but it feels like that you'd only need to have like one of them like go wrong and you'd lose all your maple syrup out.
You have to check them every day. Like you have to check the lines. I don't want to be
checking them longer than that. I'd want to set up in fact, maybe I'll set up a system to prevent this. But safeguard against it.
But your instinct is right, because maple syrup is crazy valuable. In the 1930s, the United States, they were like pretty dominant in it. Then Canada like took them over. Yeah. Canada is now like the lead force in maple syrup production.
Good for them.
And
I mean, it's your flag.
So it is our flag, so we better be good at it.
Not syrup, obviously, the leaf. So
Quebec is responsible for 70% of the world's output of maple syrup. And one barrel of maple syrup is worth $1,800, which is apparently 25 times the value of a barrel of crude oil.
I was about to look that up to see how much that was in comparison, because that's quite often how they'll go, that's, because that's the yardstick that people use is barrels of oil. So the fact that you've provided me with that information already,
boom,
that tells you exactly how valuable that is. That's crazy.
And there is this.
Does it come in barrels?
It does come in barrels. So there is some controversy within how the maple syrup industry is structured within Canada, and essentially, I watched a documentary about it. I did fall asleep during the documentary.
It must have been riveting.
Like, but I got the beginning bit where basically there is a giant federation of maple syrup supply, like a giant federation, and you have to make, as a maple syrup producer, you have to fill a certain quota. Anything that you make over the quota goes into a giant reserve.
Yeah.
And then so if there are low producing years, they'll take it out of the reserve and they'll keep the stock of maple syrup in the world roughly at the same place.
Okay.
But by doing that, they're controlling the price. So it's kind of like this, like, basically it's like OPEC, but for maple syrup.
So it can't basically get crazy expensive because there's a shortage. There's
Well,
always...
it could. They completely control the price. So it's just like, it's exactly like what you would imagine with
But
OPEC.
the companies can't do it.
You can't do it as an individual.
Yeah,
It has to be edicted by the federation.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot of the power out of the hands of the individual producers.
I'm on board with this.
Are you?
Yeah.
It's very controversial. So the documentary I was watching, there's a series on Netflix called Dirty Money.
Yeah. I've heard of it.
Yeah, they have one episode on there called the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist.
Yeah.
Basically, some people were not pleased with the system of doing things where there was a sort of central control over the price of maple syrup, and there was all of these tanks of maple syrup
Tories,
being stored in one area. And they decided they were going to break in and they were going to steal some maple syrup. And they stole $18.7 million
Blimey.
worth of maple syrup. And it is the largest theft in Canadian history. This happened in 2011, 2012. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers discovered that 1,000 barrels may have been stolen from one of their warehouses. And it just kind of took on, like, all of the cast of characters that you would imagine in this are completely there. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, Vanity Fair did a very deep dive into this and wrote like a massive article about it.
Yeah.
The documentary itself. So John Lyons, you know him, you love him. We decided to try and watch it. We both fell asleep during the documentary. And like, John Lyons does not fall asleep in the middle of the day watching television. Like, that is like, he does not.
It was that boring.
Yeah. So I can't say I highly recommend the documentary itself, but the Vanity Fair article is very good.
I was going to say that when you said about, what was it, 1,600 barrels getting nicked or whatever, that, to me, all I had in my brain when you said about that was the theft of the federal bank in Die Hard with a Vengeance when they steal all the gold.
Yeah.
So I think, because maple syrup is gold as well,
yeah,
right? So there's a connection there. They should do a film about this theft and get whoever directed Die Hard 3, can't remember, to make it, and it would be really exciting and you wouldn't fall asleep. And you could have an all Canadian cast.
Oh my word.
It would be made with all Canadian...
like some Ryan Reynolds, some Seth Rogen.
Ryan Gosling. I had to Google them, by the way, so I can read them out. Mike Myers.
Cameo by Jim Carrey.
Jim Carrey, the unexpectedly Canadian actor. Michael J. Fox is Canadian.
Yeah.
Another unexpected.
He's a massive Canadian.
Sounds like an insult.
It's not. He would wear that. If I would say that to his face, and he would be very proud.
Keanu
like,
Reeves.
Yeah, Keanu Reeves is a Canadian. There's a
Dan Aykroyd. Mate, anyone listening who isn't Canadian, just Google Canadian actors and go through the list, and I guarantee you will be surprised by maybe 1 in 4.
There is an amazing video of Keanu Reeves doing a like a little story about a teddy bear's picnic for the CBC. I want to say in the 1980s, no, maybe 70s. Like, keep in mind, Keanu Reeves is the same age as Nigel Farage.
He's really old, isn't he?
Which blows my mind.
Yeah. I didn't look it.
It is one of the best things that I've ever seen on the internet. So I'll put a link up to that of Keanu Reeves at the teddy bear picnic.
I'd like Rick Moranis to be in it. Pamela Anderson's Canadian.
Yeah, she's from Ladysmith, British Columbia.
Like those guys that were on Paul Simon's Graceland.
That's Ladysmith, Mombasa.
This honestly is amazing. Catherine O'Hara, that's the mum in Home Alone, isn't it?
Yep, she's Canadian. Every time I watch that film at Christmas, I point that out to you.
There is a lot when we're casting this film, because I think we'll probably make it. We've got a lot to choose from, basically.
Jason Reitman, Canadian, he can direct it. Or James Cameron, Canadian, he could direct it.
James Cameron can do it. Maybe not right for him, actually.
Well, he did Terminator.
Yeah, that's true, but that's not the vibe that I'm going for with this film. not quite.
Oh yeah, the English producer messing about.
Cool. Let's go. Let's make that. Okay, I'll write a script when I get in.
Excellent.
I might have to watch that documentary and try and struggle through it just so I know the actual story.
If you can keep your eyes open for 50 minutes.
All I know at the moment is someone stole.
It's like less exciting than the Hatton Garden like theft, but like way more valuable.
It's more fun, isn't it? Because they stole maple syrup.
They stole barrels of maple syrup.
Like, just think what that actual
the
theft
logistics
looked like.
of stealing 1,000 barrels is not easy to sell on the black market.
Especially considering it's not like any other food stuff that you don't want it to get nicked, but it's not like massively like valuable. But as we've already pointed out,
this is gold.
This is worth more than oil.
Yeah.
So it is valuable. So you'd think the security would be really high.
Which also brings us to an issue about maple syrup that I think most Canadians will get on board with. Of like, when you are having your pancakes and you go for the condiment of choice, a lot of restaurants don't actually want to give you maple syrup because the overhead is too high for them to actually pay for it. So they'll give you a like imitation like golden syrup type like sugar, like what you would get like out of high fructose,
like the non-brewed condiment equivalent.
And so like to actually get like strong, like good maple syrup is an investment. Like, it's not like restaurants like aren't necessarily just kind of like eagerly handing it away. So like if you have something,
one that we have here,
Clark's.
No, I don't think it is. It's in the green. Is it a green? Because it comes in a tin.
Oh yeah, that's golden syrup.
Golden. Oh, is that different?
Yeah, it's slightly different.
Okay.
But
sorry for getting them wrong.
No, it's the same sort of idea of like just like at McDonald's, you're basically getting like sugar to put on your pancakes as opposed to like the real quality maple. And like when you actually have maple syrup, you can completely taste the difference.
So the way that you get in Coca-Cola in the States, it's made with corn. It's corn syrup. Is it corn syrup?
Yeah.
It's corn syrup rather than sugar. Similar idea, as in it does the same job, but it's not the same stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. Do you want to hear some like fun news stories that have been going on involving maple syrup?
Obviously.
So a giant 7-foot syrup jug and a cheese block have popped up at the Vermont airport. They have put it there to remind travelers that you can buy the state staple online instead of losing it at security when liquids get confiscated, because people are obviously buying their maple syrup and then trying to take it in their hand luggage.
It's too big, yeah.
And due to the restrictions...
What was it we were talking about recently that they had that thing going on?
Barbecue sauce in Nashville, Tennessee.
They were taking it off people, weren't they?
Yeah. I think it's a common problem of people just trying to take condiments in their hand luggage. Wrap it in your socks, put it in a plastic bag, put it in your checked luggage.
You don't often see it on those like signs that say things that you can't take on planes. It doesn't often say condiments.
Yeah.
I think maybe we need to
petition.
Yeah, start a campaign to get it added to stop people losing these condiments that they've sometimes potentially flown specifically to certain areas to pick up.
I just think the lesson is put it in your checked bag. Like, it's not like...
But, people are morons. They need to be reminded of this.
Have you gone through, like, the airport I went through, like, fairly recently, and it was, like, this woman, it blew her mind that they were, like, asking her to take off her belts, that they wanted her computer to be in a separate bag, they wanted her shoes to be taken off, and it was like...
When was the last time you've been on a plane? I've been doing that since, like, 2002.
Yeah. It's like, is this your first time flying ever? Because this is, like, the space standard of airport security. Yeah. Like, are you kidding me? That really bugs me when you get stuck behind one of those people.
Oh, what is this? Just do it properly. Come on. Just basically take all of your clothes off and walk through there and get on with your life.
And, like, why are you making a fuss over it? Because those are the rules. Like, stop trying to have, like, this competition.
Oh, okay, then, you don't have to do it. Yeah, it's fine.
You know what? You're fine. You're good to go.
We can tell by the fact that you're kicking up a stink about this that there's nothing that you're trying to do that is not allowed.
Like, if anybody you're going to start having an argument with, it's like, yeah, definitely a security guard before I get on an airplane. This is going to benefit everybody well.
I'd like Denis Villeneuve to direct this film, by the way.
Oh.
Do you know the guy that did Arrival and Sicario particularly? I think
he's got a taste for the maple syrup.
Well, Sicario is about a Mexican hitman, basically, and the sort of drug war between Texas and Mexico. So I think that there's a similar that he's got form for making films like this.
And
he's
there'll be a
Canadian,
lot of
that's
like
the point.
Yeah, and there'll be a lot of like, tasteful French accents.
It would look
and, like,
really good.
You know that like shift when all of a sudden in a conversation they'll start it off in like the native tongue and then they put it into English. Like they do maybe the first 2 lines in native tongue and then they take it to English for all the dum-dums like us who can't read subtitles.
No, I'd like this to be in, because it would have to be in. It would be in
French.
French,
It'd be in
wouldn't
French,
it?
yeah.
Yeah. No, we'd stick with the language, definitely.
Another top news story about maple syrup this week. Pie Minster. Are you familiar?
Pie Minister, yep. I think a lot of people would have been introduced to them at Glastonbury. They used to sell pies there, but then they branched out and they sell them everywhere now. Supermarkets, in fact.
Supermarket, yeah. They've launched a new ice cream topped with pork scratching and bacon, and a bourbon maple syrup.
Did you say an ice cream?
Yeah.
Pie Minister?
Yeah.
What?
So it's called the Pork Pie Scream, and it is made of vanilla ice cream laced with free-range British bacon, bourbon maple syrup, applesauce, and pork scratching on top.
It's just sort of like a breakfast ice cream.
It's like a savory ice cream. It's like to hit the salty, sweet umami
I
junction.
I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to make out that it's not just for sweet foods, and that's why it counts as a condiment.
It does count as a condiment.
This is part of your case that you're building.
I'm very subtly building a case.
I'm seeing. Not subtly enough, because I'm seeing right through it.
And the other exhibit I would like to enter,
Exhibit J.
Exhibit J, into the defense of maple syrup as a top condiment.
Right. It does need defending.
2018, a study from a Michigan university said, hey, climate change, you're going to wipe out all the maple trees. And guess what? No more maple syrup. So maple syrup is potentially going extinct.
Yeah.
And it'll only just take a few hundred years.
Wow.
So your great-grandchildren may not know what real maple syrup tastes like.
You're trying to say that it needs to go on the island so that it survives beyond extinction.
Yeah.
And we can Jurassic Park it into recreating it later down the line. Make a maple syrup theme park.
We're going to need to
where people get eaten by giant maple syrup monsters.
Lava flows.
And Jeff Goldblum turns up.
Yeah. Sticky Jeff Goldblum.
Sticky Jeff Goldblum. I think he's sticky a lot of the time.
What do you think?
Is that the end?
Yes.
Is that the story of maple syrup?
I think so. I mean, like, I'm sure that people are going to Canadians are going to get really mad at me and say that I, like, left stuff out. But, like, obviously, this is, like, an abridged history of a condiment.
We can't include everything, Canada.
Yeah. But it's on our flag, and it's in our hearts. And if you cut me, I'm pretty sure I bleed maple syrup.
Well, then we don't have to
and
worry about it.
I'm not even a real Canadian. Like, I'm an immigrant. Like,
we don't have to worry about it going extinct then, do we? Because if you just cut a load of Canadians, it'll all come flowing out.
It won't really. It's more metaphorical than that. It's like, the body of Christ isn't really a wafer cracker.
The problem is, right, you admitted earlier on that you don't really get it if you ask for it in a restaurant or whatever.
You have to, no, you do, but you have to, like, make sure.
Are they giving you something else?
Yeah. It's like an unbrewed condiment situation, right? Like, it's not like, oh, it doesn't exist.
That's not the main issue, though. My main issue is that it's too sweet.
Okay, I would like to say that, like, yes, it is sweet, but you need to have a balance of flavors.
Well, no.
And sweet is, like, on the list. Like, you can put this on ice cream. If you're running low blood sugar, have some maple syrup. You can, like, marinate it on meat. You can replace sugar in, like, baking. It's like a superfood that way. Like, it's so versatile that you don't even realize. And it's like, not just like, oh, I've replaced sugar. It's like, oh, I've replaced sugar and it tastes delicious. You can candy bacon. You can candy any form of, like, pork product and make a delicious glaze for it. Like, there are so many uses to maple syrup that, like, it was legitimately hard to do the research because, like, every, like, thing, if you go down the O's on the Google, is like a different recipe for making maple syrup awesome.
There are many, 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 many uses for cushions. Doesn't make them a condiment.
You can't eat a cushion. You can
if you really want to.
But you wouldn't take maple syrup. What are the condiments?
No, you're right.
You wouldn't take it, like, just, like, straight out of a jar with, like, a spoon and eat it. It is shelf stable. It is, like, free, like, asterisks, are you getting the right thing, whatever. But generally, with breakfast foods, you get free maple syrup offered with you. Like, I understand contention over guacamole in the sense of like it's not free all the time. Sure, maybe I'll give you that one. But when it comes to maple syrup, you do get it for free.
Still too sweet. Look at everything else on this list. Everything else we've covered. I'm not going to read them all because there's 20 something. But none of them would be considered in the same way as maple syrup in that it's in terms of the sweetness, because pretty much any of those I would consider having on pretty much any savoury food within reason. Maple syrup, you wouldn't like
maple glazed salmon.
It is so specific to like one thing.
It is not.
It is.
It is so not.
It's like a few breakfast things, and that is it.
That is not it. And you need to be opening up like your world of eating because like maple glazed anything.
Look, I am not denying
anything on the
you.
barbecue with maple syrup, delicious. Like candy.
You wouldn't pour it on top afterwards, though, would you? You might maybe dust it on a little bit as a glaze. That's not a condiment.
You'd put it on as like a glaze, and then you could put some more on
That's
top
a marinade.
afterwards.
That's not a condiment.
That's multiple uses. It's a versatile use. It's versatile.
I'm not having it.
Fine.
I am not saying that you can't consider it a condiment. I am saying there is no chance in hell this is getting anywhere near my island. No chance.
Well,
absolutely no chance.
As a Canadian, I would politely disagree with you. And
what would you lose in favour of maple syrup?
I think I would probably lose one of the hot sauces.
Sriracha or Ajika?
Yeah. That's the Sophie's choice of which one, but I think that's logical. Maybe Ajika? I don't know.
That didn't last long, did it?
But I mean, it's maple syrup. Listen,
it's like Canadian ketchup.
As a Canadian,
just put it on everything.
I respect your opinion, and I understand it cannot go on the island.
No.
However, I shall write my love letter.
Mm-hmm.
I will put it in one of the wonderful bottles with a tiny little spout on the end and little handle that's just for one finger. Why is the handle only for one finger? I don't understand.
Someone needs to go in there and disrupt the maple syrup.
And when the
industry.
Canadian Coast Guard comes to save us,
they'll just see that you've got maple syrup, or they've seen you're Canadian and you didn't take maple syrup with you, and they'll leave you behind. You don't deserve to be saved.
No, they'll take me and they'll leave you behind.
I'm fine. I'm fine there. I've got all the condiments I need.
I'll tell them. It's your fault maple syrup isn't there.
They'll say you should have tried harder to get it there.
I don't think they would. They'll be very Canadian. They'd be like, oh, alrighty, that's okay. Don't you worry about it.
They'll be like, yeah, there's no way.
Let's save you off this island
what
there.
An idiot that guy is.
Oh, bud, you had an ordeal, bud.
For some reason, your Canadian accent seems so absurd. When you put it on, I'm like, that's not how Canadians talk.
No, it really isn't. But we do say bud a lot. Hey, bud.
Well, that's a sort of feels slightly.
It's bittersweet.
Unsatisfactory end to an episode. I feel like maple syrup sort of left in limbo. Not from my point of view, obviously. I think it feels like one that we should really ask listeners to have their say on.
Let's put up a poll on the Twitter machines.
The issue will be, obviously, that you've got your Canadian following, and then we all know what they're going to say. So it'll probably be down to the Brits
I bet you
to decide.
Okay, so you're going for like a full like England versus Canada war.
Basically, yeah.
Don't be like that.
So do let us know. Twitter, we are at Desert Island Dip.
Single dip.
Facebook, we are Desert Island Dips, plural.
All the dips.
If there's anyone out there that would like to really write a full-on impassioned argument for or against, it's probably best to do that by email, which is desertislanddips@gmail.com. Are we going to report back on this any point?
Look on the internet for the updates.
We'll tweet it.
We can't
it's
be
difficult
asked
to put
to
them in.
re-edit things. And
yeah.
No, it'll live in the third world of the social medias for the updates on what happens there. And, we'll also link to the awesome Vanity Fair article about the maple heist.
Oh, yeah.
Maple syrup heist.
Yeah. So you'd say that's better than watching the documentary.
I fell asleep in the documentary.
But you didn't fall asleep during reading the article.
No.
Well, that says it all, doesn't it? Thanks very much for listening, everybody. I'm going to go and throw some maple syrup in the bin.
It's so unnecessary. Just don't take it to the island. You don't need to just desecrate it. Like,
I'm going to go and shout at it and tell it it's not a condiment
no.
for hours on end.
You know what? Please go to the local Sainsbury's and just start shouting at the aisle of maple syrup. I would.
I'm going to do it in Sainsbury's. I'll buy it and take it home.
Oh, that's a way more sane behavior, is to shout at a condiment in the privacy of your own home. Yeah.
I do it all the time.
Maybe the NHS should get that ward ready for you.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, probably with something that we may be closer to agreeing on. I don't know. Don't know yet.
Well, here's a life update. Next time we talk to you, I'll be a married lady. I'll be an old married broad.
What's going to change, do you think?
My hair, maybe.
Okay.
Is that...
It's great. No one's going to notice, so that's fine.
You will not notice a thing.
Right. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Bye.